There is a very strange question that perhaps you have never asked yourself before going to sleep. What could cause an ordinary person to slowly give another person the power to make decisions about their own life? The story does not always begin with a threat. Sometimes it begins with a smile, a greeting, a group of people who are willing to listen, a warm feeling that, after so many years of searching, you have finally found a place where you belong. And that is precisely what makes the psychology of cults so worthy of reflection. Because behind the stories of cults, we do not see only extreme individuals or strange systems. We see deeply human needs, the desire to be loved, to be recognized, to belong, to be understood, and to be given a sense of meaning in life. Carl Gustav Jung spent much of his life exploring the deeper regions that people often do not want to look into: the unconscious, the inner shadow, the need to belong, and the archetypal images that can quietly shape the way we think. And so, tonight, we will not enter this world to judge anyone. We will enter it to understand why a compliment can become an invisible thread, why a sense of belonging can gradually turn into dependence, why a community that once made us feel loved can become a place that makes us afraid to leave, and, more importantly, why sometimes our own minds help sustain beliefs that, somewhere deep inside, a part of us has already begun to question. Throughout this journey of 100 truths about the psychology of cults, we will move slowly through these doors from love bombing, the charisma of a leader, isolation, psychological control, cognitive dissonance, and the sunk cost effect, to the moment when a person begins to awaken and learns once again how to trust themselves. This is Channel Name, where we explore profound stories about the human mind through the lens of Carl Jung, at a slow and gentle pace, so that you can reflect, relax, and gradually drift into sleep. If you enjoy journeys like this, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us until the end of tonight's journey. Now, lower the lights a little. Let your shoulders relax. Breathe in very slowly and breathe out very gently, because the first door we are about to open does not lead to a strange or unfamiliar place. It leads to a deeply human part of ourselves. Entering the world of cult psychology, there is something rather paradoxical when we begin talking about the psychology of cults. People who become drawn into a high-control group are not necessarily naive, weak, or unintelligent. They may be educated, have jobs, have families, and have very ordinary dreams. They may have once lived completely independent lives, made their own decisions, and believed that they understood themselves well. But then, at some point, they encounter a person, a community, or a system of beliefs that makes them feel, finally, I have found a place where I belong. And perhaps it is precisely from that very simple sentence that we can begin to understand the complexity of cult psychology, the psychology of high-control groups. When we hear the word cult, we often imagine strange rituals, extreme leaders, or communities living apart from the rest of the world. But if we look only at those images, we may miss the most thought-provoking part of the story. Because before a system of control takes shape, there is often something very ordinary at its foundation: the needs of human beings. Human beings need to belong. From primitive communities to modern society, we have always searched for people we can call us. We need friends, family, colleagues, and others who share our values and beliefs. When we are surrounded by people who understand us, the nervous system seems able to relax. We no longer have to constantly explain who we are. A sense of belonging can heal a loneliness that sometimes even we ourselves do not know we are carrying. But precisely because this need is so powerful, it can also become a point of vulnerability that can be exploited. Imagine someone going through a period of loneliness. Perhaps they have just lost a relationship, Perhaps they have moved to a new city. Perhaps they are disappointed with their work, have lost their sense of direction, or simply feel that their life no longer carries much meaning. Then, one day, they meet a group of people. They smile. They ask how they are doing. They remember their name. They listen. They tell the newcomer that they are special. And for the first time in a long while, that person feels seen. There is nothing frightening about that need. In fact, it is completely healthy. We all want to be loved. We all want to be recognized. We all want to know that our existence matters to someone. What is worth observing is how a healthy need can change when it is placed within an unhealthy system of power. At first, the group may provide a sense of belonging. Then, that sense of belonging may become a condition. You are loved because you are loyal. You are recognized because you obey. You belong here as long as you do not ask too many questions. And from that moment onward, love begins to come with conditions. Recognition begins to have a price. Freedom begins to have limits. This is where the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung can help us reflect more deeply, not as the sole explanation for cults, but as a lens through which we can observe the deeper regions of human psychology. Jung devoted considerable attention to the relationship between the conscious ego and the unconscious parts of the mind. He believed that human beings do not completely know themselves. Beneath the thoughts that we can name, there exist deeper memories, emotions, conflicts, and psychological images. And when a person intensely longs for something, love, recognition, power, meaning, or a sense of protection, they may become especially sensitive to symbols or people who seem to represent what they are searching for. A charismatic leader may no longer be seen simply as an ordinary human being. In the eyes of those who trust them absolutely, that person may gradually become an image of a guide, a savior, someone who possesses special knowledge, or even someone who has the answers to questions that life itself has not yet been able to answer. And this is a very important point. Human beings do not seek only truth. Human beings also seek meaning. Sometimes, the two are not entirely the same. The truth may tell us that life is complex, uncertain, and that not every question has an answer. But a closed belief system can offer a simpler story. This is why you suffer. This is why the world is wrong. This is the person who has the answers. This is the only path. That certainty can bring an astonishing sense of relief, because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Human beings often want to know where they are going. They want to know who is right and who is wrong. They want to know what has meaning. They want to know how they should live. And when a system provides all of those answers, the mind may feel as though it has finally found a place to rest. But there is a profound difference between being guided and giving someone else the power to decide your life. A healthy community can help you grow while still allowing you to disagree. A healthy relationship can love you without demanding that you abandon yourself. A healthy belief system can provide meaning without turning every question into a sin. And a truly safe community will not tell you that you must choose between them and everyone else in the world. This is precisely the boundary we will need to observe throughout this journey. Not is this belief strange or normal. Not is this group different, but does the person within the group still retain the power to make their own choices? Can they say no? Can they ask questions? Can they maintain relationships outside the group? Can they change their mind without being punished? And most importantly, can they leave without having to sacrifice their entire life? If the answer gradually becomes no, then we have entered a very different psychological territory. And the most frightening thing is that this territory does not necessarily begin with fear. It may begin with warmth, with an invitation, an embrace, a sentence that says, "Here, you are no longer alone." Perhaps that is why, when studying the psychology of cults, we should not ask only, why did they believe? A deeper question might be, what had they longed for? And how deeply had they longed for it before they found this place? Because behind many stories of control is still the story of a human being searching for something very simple: to be seen, to be loved, to belong, and to believe that their life has meaning. Tonight, as we continue to move deeper into this world, keep that question gently in your mind, because the next door will lead us to a place that seems completely harmless. A place that does not begin with commands, does not begin with threats, but begins with kindness. And sometimes, that is precisely what makes it so difficult to notice the thread that is slowly being tied around us. The first door. When a cult begins with kindness. Imagine a very ordinary afternoon. You have just come through a long day. Perhaps work has left you exhausted. A relationship has just ended. Or perhaps you have simply lived for too long with the feeling that you are standing outside the lives of other people. You walk past a place and encounter a group of people. They smile at you. They ask your name. They listen to your story without rushing to judge you. One of them says, "You can sit with us." Just one very small sentence. But to someone who is lonely, it can carry the weight of an entire lifeline. That is where we need to begin when exploring the psychology of high-control groups. Not every religious group or community with different beliefs is a cult. And kindness itself is certainly not a sign of a dangerous group. What is worth observing is what happens after the feeling of being welcomed has taken root. Because human beings are naturally wired to seek connection. From the time we are children, we learn to read the expressions, voices, and eyes of others. We search for signals that tell us, am I safe here? Am I accepted? Do I belong here? When the answer is yes, the body and mind can often begin to relax, and a group of people who know how to create that feeling can become incredibly appealing. Not necessarily because they are deceiving you from the very beginning. Sometimes, the people who welcome newcomers genuinely believe that they are doing something good. They have received the same kind of care themselves. They once felt rescued from loneliness, given a sense of purpose, and supported by a community. So when they meet someone searching for the same thing, they may sincerely and enthusiastically open their arms. And that is precisely what makes the story so complicated. Not every dangerous door carries a warning sign. Some doors are painted in beautiful colors. There is laughter on the other side. There is music. There are hugs. There are people calling your name with a warmth and familiarity you have not felt in a long time. And when someone is starved for connection, that feeling can become especially powerful. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, we might see this as a reminder of the power of deep psychological needs and inner images. Human beings do not merely want to survive. We want our lives to have meaning. We want to feel that we belong to a story larger than ourselves. A community can provide exactly that story. It tells you that you are not meaningless, that your suffering has a reason, that your life has a direction, that the people around you understand something the outside world does not. In the beginning, this can even create positive changes. A lonely person begins to make friends. Someone who has lost their direction begins to have a purpose. Someone who feels invisible begins to be heard. The problem is not that people find a community. The problem is when the community gradually becomes the condition for a person to be loved. Imagine this very small but important difference. A healthy community might say, "You are welcome here, whether you agree with us or not." A controlling system may gradually become, "You are welcome here because you agree with us." The two sentences sound almost alike, but the psychological distance between them can be enormous. In the first case, belonging is a choice. In the second, belonging becomes a reward. And when belonging becomes a reward, the fear of losing it begins to appear. A person may start asking themselves before they speak, "Will this disappoint them?" Before asking a question, "Will they think I lack faith?" Before meeting someone from outside the group, will they think I am betraying the group? You may notice something strange here. No one has needed to threaten them yet. No one has needed to lock the doors. No one has needed to stand behind them and watch. Control begins to move from the outside to the inside. People begin regulating their own behavior in order to protect their sense of belonging. And this is one of the themes we will continue to encounter in the sections ahead. Power does not always need to express itself through commands. Sometimes, the strongest form of power is when a person begins telling themselves, I am not allowed to do this. But tonight, we do not need to go too far. Let us simply pause at the first door, because there is a very important lesson here. Kindness is not the enemy. Kindness is one of the most beautiful things in human nature. A simple question about how someone is doing can rescue a difficult day. A friendship can help someone move through loneliness. A safe community can help a person grow. What we need to learn is how to distinguish between kindness that gives freedom and kindness that creates an emotional debt. Someone who genuinely cares about you will not need you to sacrifice yourself to prove your gratitude. A healthy community will not ask you to cut yourself off from the world to prove that you belong to them. A trustworthy guide will not be afraid of your questions. And a truly safe place will not force you to choose between love and freedom. Perhaps that is what we should carry with us as we continue this journey. Not every hides a secret plan. Not every community is dangerous. Not every different belief is a cult. But when a place makes you feel loved, try observing one more very small thing. Are you still allowed to be yourself there? Can you say no? Can you keep your old friends? Can you have doubts? Can you change your mind? And if one day you want to leave, will they still love you as a human being? Or does that love exist only as long as you stay? Perhaps the answers to these questions will not appear today, but sometimes, simply learning how to ask the questions is already the first step toward protecting your own freedom. And just beyond that first door, we will encounter something even more subtle. A place where care does not merely make you feel welcomed, but makes you feel more loved than you have ever felt in your entire life. That is the world of love bombing, where love can become so intense that a person begins to fear the thought of living without it. Love bombing. The feeling of being loved so deeply that you cannot leave. There are times in life when what we need most is not advice, nor an answer. We simply want someone to look at us and say, I understand you. A simple sentence like that can sometimes reach a very deep place within the mind, especially when we have already gone through a long period of loneliness, rejection, disappointment, or the feeling that we are not important enough to anyone. At such a time, if a group of people appears and gives us what seems like unconditional attention, that feeling can become so powerful that we do not merely like them, we begin to need them. That is one of the things we need to understand when talking about love bombing, a term commonly used to describe giving someone an excessive amount of attention, praise, affection, or closeness within a short period of time, particularly when it is used as a way to create attachment and influence. It is important to make a distinction. Not every expression of enthusiasm or affection is love bombing. A friendly person may genuinely care about you. A new community may be happy that you have joined. What becomes concerning is when excessive affection gradually becomes a tool for creating dependence and is then given or withdrawn according to the level of obedience. Imagine that you walk into an unfamiliar room. Before you have even had a chance to say much, someone asks how you are doing. They remember the things you told them. They text you. They invite you to share a meal. They introduce you to other people. They tell you how happy they are that you showed up. Perhaps they tell you that you are special, that you have a different energy from everyone they have met before, that they feel as though they have known you for a very long time. If you are lonely, these things can feel so beautiful that they are almost impossible to resist. You begin to feel that you have found a place where you belong. And when that feeling is repeated day after day, the brain begins to form a powerful emotional bond. You do not simply miss those people. You miss the feeling they create within you: being seen, being recognized, being needed, being loved. That is when the story becomes subtle, because human beings can become deeply attached to places that make them feel valuable. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, we can reflect on something deeper. Human beings often do not seek only another person, but also seek parts of themselves that they feel are missing. Someone who constantly feels meaningless may be drawn to a community that makes them feel important. Someone who has lost their direction may be drawn to a person who seems to have all the answers. Someone who is lonely may cling tightly to the first place where they feel accepted. This does not mean they are weak. It simply means they are human. And precisely because this need is so deeply human, it can become a point through which power can easily enter. At first, affection may be given abundantly, but then, small things begin to change. A compliment appears when you agree. Closeness appears when you obey. An invitation is withdrawn when you ask questions. A group of friends becomes distant when you do not participate. Someone who once told you that you were special may now tell you that you are disappointing them. And the mind begins to learn a very dangerous lesson. When I do what is right, I am loved. When I resist, I am abandoned. At this point, love is no longer simply love. It becomes a system of rewards. Obedience brings warmth. Resistance brings coldness. And a person begins adjusting their behavior in order to regain that original feeling of being loved. This is a very powerful psychological mechanism, because when a reward does not appear consistently, but instead arrives in an unpredictable way, a person can become especially persistent in searching for it. Like someone who keeps returning to a door that once opened for them. They think, maybe this time, everything will go back to the way it was. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I just need to try harder. Maybe if I am more loyal, they will love me again. And so, a cycle begins. No chains are necessary. No walls are necessary. No one needs to stand beside them and give orders. All that is needed is the fear of losing love. Perhaps this is one of the most thought-provoking aspects of love bombing. What keeps a person from leaving is sometimes not the fear of what will happen if they leave, but the longing for the beautiful experience they had when they first entered. They are not only afraid of losing the group, they are afraid of losing the version of themselves that once existed within that group. The version that was listened to, admired, needed, called special. And this is where we need to be very gentle with those who have gone through such an experience. From the outside, other people can easily say, "Why don't you just leave?" But leaving such a system is not simply a matter of walking out of a room. It may mean giving up an entire network of relationships, giving up a sense of belonging, facing loneliness, and sometimes facing the painful question, if the people I trusted most were wrong, then what can I still believe in? And so, there is one sign that is especially worth remembering. Healthy love does not require you to lose your ability to think. A healthy relationship is not afraid of questions. A healthy community does not need you to prove your loyalty by giving up other people. And genuine care does not disappear simply because you say, "I don't agree." Perhaps freedom does not mean that you need no one. Freedom means being able to love others while still remaining yourself. Being able to belong to a community while still having the right to step outside of it. Being guided while still retaining the right to think. And being able to say, "Thank you for loving me." But at the same time, also say, "I still need to be myself." Tonight, if you are listening to this story in the quiet of your room, let that question rest gently in your mind, not so that you begin to doubt everyone, but so that you remember that the most beautiful kind of love is not the love that makes us unable to leave. It is the love that allows us to stay freely. And when love begins to be used as a reward for obedience, something has changed. The next door in this journey will lead us to an even deeper question. What happens when the person you once admired not only wants you to believe them, but begins to want to become the person who decides what is right, what is wrong, and who you should become? That is when we enter the power of the leader, when charisma begins to become power. The power of the leader. When charisma becomes power, there are people who can walk into a room and seem to do very little. Yet everyone's eyes naturally turn toward them. They speak slowly, but people want to listen. They tell a story, and the people around them feel that the story somehow carries meaning for their own lives. They possess confidence, eloquence, calmness, or such intense conviction that others begin to feel. This person knows where they are going. That is part of charisma, personal magnetism. And charisma itself is not a bad thing. A charismatic leader can inspire others, help people move through crises, encourage them to become more courageous, and bring them together to build something meaningful. Throughout history, many positive movements have also been led by people with a powerful ability to inspire. But there is a very thin line between someone who inspires and someone who wants to become the sole source of truth. And that boundary often does not appear in the beginning. It may begin with admiration. Someone says something that makes you feel understood. You begin turning to them when you encounter difficulties. They offer advice. Some of the advice is right, then a few more pieces of advice. Over time, you do not simply trust what they say. You begin to trust their judgment more than your own. This is a very important transition, because a healthy mentor usually wants you to become increasingly independent. A high control leader may gradually make you increasingly dependent. At first, you ask, "What do you think I should do?" Then, "Do you think this is right or wrong? Do you think when to?" And eventually, "What do you think I should become?" The question has changed. You are no longer seeking guidance. You are giving another person the power to define who you are. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, this is where we can reflect on the power of psychological images and symbols. A person with extraordinary charisma may be perceived by those around them not simply as an ordinary individual, but as an image of the guide, the wise one, or the one who has the answers. And when such an image becomes too powerful, people may begin to see more in the leader than the leader's actual human self. Weaknesses are overlooked, contradictions are explained away, mistakes are justified. Because if that person has become a symbol of what is right, acknowledging that they are wrong is no longer simply a matter of correcting an opinion. It can cause an entire belief system to tremble. That is why a leader's power does not necessarily lie in how many orders they can give. It lies in how much power other people have given them to define reality. They may begin deciding what is good, what is bad, who can be trusted, who the enemy is, what constitutes noble sacrifice, what constitutes selfishness, and sometimes even what is called love can change. A person who sacrifices their time for the group may be called devoted. Sacrificing money may be called faith. Sacrificing relationships outside the group may be called loyalty. Sacrificing privacy may be called maturity. And at some point, a person may look back on their life and realize that things they once considered personal boundaries are now being called by completely different names. This is a very subtle psychological mechanism, because language does not merely describe reality. It also helps shape the way we interpret reality. If an action is called betrayal, the person who carries it out may feel guilty. If that same action is called self-protection, the emotional experience may be completely different. And so, when a leader has the power to define language, they may also gradually influence the way members understand their own experiences. A person who is exhausted may no longer be seen as burned out. They may be told that they are lacking faith. A person who has doubts may no longer be seen as thinking. They may be called weak. A person who wants to leave may no longer be seen as making a choice. They may be regarded as a traitor. And when every objection is defined as a flaw in the person who objects, the system almost loses its ability to correct itself. This is when charisma begins to become power, not because the leader suddenly becomes frightening, but because other people gradually no longer feel that they have the right to question the leader. Perhaps the most thought-provoking part is this: that power is often built through the voluntary actions of the people beneath them. They give their trust, they give their admiration, they give their time, they give their money, they give their secrets, and sometimes they even give away their ability to judge for themselves. A healthy community can have a leader, but the leader is not the sole source of truth. They can be questioned, they can make mistakes, they can be replaced, and most importantly, members still have the right to keep parts of their lives for themselves without needing permission. That is the difference between leadership and control. Good leadership makes people stronger. Control makes people believe they cannot exist on their own. And perhaps this is also something we should remember when looking at any charismatic figure, not only within religious groups, but in modern life itself. Be careful when someone begins wanting to become the answer to every question. Pay attention when they not only want you to listen to them, but want you to stop listening to everyone else. Observe when loyalty to them is placed above honesty with yourself, because someone who genuinely wants to help you grow will not need you to become smaller so that they can feel greater. A good guide does not need to take your compass away. They only help you learn how to read it. And as we continue tonight, hold on to one very simple question. Am I following someone because they help me see more clearly? Or because I have begun to believe that without them, I will not be able to see anything at all? That question is not meant to plant suspicion. It is simply a small light. Because sometimes, freedom begins at the moment a person dares to retain the right to think for themselves. And from here, the story will go deeper. Because a charismatic leader only truly has power when the community around them becomes an indispensable part of each member's life. At that point, belonging can begin to turn into dependence. And we will step through the next door. From belonging to dependence, when the group is no longer simply a community, but gradually becomes the only family a person is afraid to lose. From belonging to dependence, when the group becomes family, there is a very deep human need that we sometimes recognize only when it disappears. The feeling that we belong somewhere, not simply having a home to return to, but having people who know who we are, remember our stories, wait for us to show up, and make us feel that our existence matters to them. When we are young, family is often the first place where we learn that feeling. We learn that there are people who will call our name, protect us, comfort us when we are afraid, and hold us when the world becomes too large. As we grow older, that need does not disappear. We continue to search for it in friendship, love, community, work, and among people who share our beliefs. That is why belonging, the feeling of being part of something, is such a deeply human need, and there is nothing dangerous about the need itself. A healthy community can save someone from loneliness. It can help them find friends, purpose, and a sense of support. But the story begins to change when the community is no longer simply one part of life, but gradually becomes the whole of life. At first, everything may be beautiful. You meet people who call you brother, sister, or family. You share meals together, long conversations, rituals, trips, private stories that only people within the group understand. You begin to have a new daily routine, new friends, and a new language. Each day, you receive another signal telling you, you belong with us. And that feeling is deeply comforting. Because when people find a community after a long period of loneliness, they do not simply find new friends, they find a new version of themselves. They are no longer the person who is lost. They become the person who has found the path. No longer the outsider, but one of us. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, we can reflect on the power of collective identity and the deep psychological images that human beings carry within themselves. People do not live only through the individual ego. We also search for the feeling that we belong to something larger than ourselves. A collective symbol can create a powerful sense of unity. A shared story can make strangers feel like family. A shared belief can make an individual feel that their life has a place within a much larger picture. But that same power also has a darker side, because if a person's entire sense of worth begins to depend on the group, then losing the group is no longer simply a matter of losing a few friends. It can feel like losing oneself. Imagine that one day you begin to realize that most of your closest friends belong to the same community. Your partner is there too. Your work is connected to the group. Your weekend activities all take place with the group. Your most important conversations are with people inside the group. Even the things you believe are explained through the group system. Even the way you see your own past begins to be retold through the group's language. So what happens if one day you begin to have doubts? Who will you talk to? What if you want to leave? Where will you go? And what if everyone you love is on the other side of the door? This is precisely when belonging can turn into dependence. It is no longer, "I am here because I want to be." It gradually becomes, "I am here because I do not know who I will be if I leave." Those two sentences are worlds apart. One is a choice. The other is dependence. The frightening thing is that this transformation usually does not happen in a single day. There is no clearly defined moment when you can say, "This is exactly when I lost my freedom." It usually happens little by little. A friend from outside the group is seen as someone who does not understand you. A family member begins to be called negative. An old hobby is seen as no longer appropriate. A meeting with people outside the group makes you feel guilty. One time, you want to spend some time alone, but you are asked why you are not participating. Each individual event may seem very small, but they add up, and a person's world begins to shrink. From many sources of connection, they gradually have only one, the group. At that point, emotional dependence becomes stronger. You do not simply need the group to feel happy. You need the group to feel safe. You need the group to feel that you have value. You need the group to know what you should believe. You need the group to know who your friends are. And eventually, you need the group to know who you are. That is when the fear of losing the community can become stronger than the fear of losing freedom. A person may realize that they are no longer happy. They may begin to have doubts. But then a thought appears. If I leave, I will lose everything. And so they stay. Not because they completely believe anymore, but because the cost of not believing seems too great. Perhaps this is one of the most painful paradoxes of human psychology. We need to belong. But when the need to belong becomes too strong, we may accept sacrificing a part of our freedom to hold on to it. Because sometimes, loneliness is more frightening than control. A person may endure things that make them uncomfortable simply because they are afraid of becoming someone who no longer belongs anywhere. And this is where we need to make a very clear distinction between a healthy family and a control system that uses the image of family to create dependence. A real family does not need you to agree with everything. You can disagree with your parents. You can argue with your siblings. You can leave home. You can have a life of your own. Love does not disappear simply because you say, "I see things differently." A healthy community is the same. It does not need you to cut yourself off from the world to prove that you belong to it. It can say, "You are part of us, but you are still yourself." That is a very important difference, because real love does not need to possess. True belonging does not need to erase the individual. And a good community does not make you smaller in order to keep you there. Perhaps, in the quiet of tonight, you can gently ask yourself one question. Do the places where I belong help me become more of myself? If the answer is yes, it may be a nourishing connection. But if a place makes you increasingly afraid to think independently, afraid of people outside, afraid to say no, afraid to change, and afraid to leave, then perhaps what needs to be examined is no longer how much you belong there, but how much of yourself you have lost in order to belong. And this is precisely the next turning point in our journey. Because once a group has become the only family a person has, the outside world can very easily begin to be seen through different eyes. People who do not belong to the group may first be called people who do not understand, then dangerous. then enemies. And from that moment, an invisible boundary begins to appear. Us on one side, they on the other. That is the next door we will gently walk through. Separation from the world, when us and them appears. Separation from the world, when us and them appears. There is a very subtle moment in the process of becoming attached to a community. The outside world begins to change, even though in reality, that world remains exactly as it was. Family is still family. Old friends are still the people who once laughed with us. The familiar street is still there. Society continues to function as it always has. But within a person's mind, the meaning of all these things can gradually begin to change. People who were once called friends begin to become people who do not understand me. Family becomes people who are holding me back. And people outside the group, who were once simply strangers, may gradually come to be seen as a threat. That is when an invisible boundary begins to appear. Us on one side and them on the other. The act of distinguishing between us and them is not in itself unusual. The psychology of belonging naturally leads us to seek people who share our values, language, beliefs, or experiences. A sports team has its fans. A family has its own stories. A community has shared symbols. But when that division becomes absolute, it can turn into a very powerful tool of control. At first, us simply means people who share the same beliefs. Then it may become people who truly understand the truth. And finally, the only people who possess the truth. The change is contained in only a few words, but the psychological world of a person can change completely. Imagine that you are living in a room with many windows. Each window allows you to see a different part of the world. Family gives you one perspective. Friends give you another. Books, work, society, and people with opposing views give you still other perspectives. Not every window is correct, but that very diversity allows you to compare. It allows you to think. It allows you to recognize that one way of seeing things is not necessarily the whole of reality. A high control system may begin by closing those windows one by one, not necessarily through commands. Sometimes, only through very simple statements. Your family does not understand you. Your old friends are pulling you back into who you used to be. People outside cannot understand what we are doing. Do not listen to people who have never experienced this. Each statement may seem like nothing more than a warning, but if repeated often enough, they can create a closed psychological world. And when every outside source of information becomes suspect, the group begins to become the primary source of information. Then, gradually, the only source of information. This is an extremely important change, because if a person hears only one system's explanation of the world, it becomes very difficult for them to verify that system. If the group says that the outside world is dangerous, the person has less contact with the outside world. When there is no contact, they have no opportunity to discover that the world may not be as dangerous as they were told. And that very lack of contact is then used as evidence. See? People outside do not understand us. A closed circle has been created. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, we can reflect on the way human beings project parts of their inner world onto the world outside them. Jung was particularly interested in the shadow, those parts of the psyche that the ego does not want to recognize or accept. In ordinary life, we can all experience this. The qualities we do not want to see in ourselves can sometimes be easily recognized in other people. A community can experience a similar mechanism. The things the group fears, hates, or rejects may be placed onto the image of the outsider. They become selfish. They become ignorant. They become dangerous. They become people who have not yet awakened. And when a group begins to see the world in this way, Members are no longer simply taught that they are following a different path. They are taught that the path outside is wrong. This is a very significant difference. Because if I believe that my path is good, I can still respect someone who walks a different path. But if I believe that only my path is right, then other people are no longer simply different from me. They become wrong. And when others are defined as wrong, isolating them becomes easier. It becomes especially dangerous when isolation is dressed in the clothing of love. We only want to protect you. We do not want you to be influenced. We are afraid you will return to your old life. Those words may genuinely come from a place of concern. But if the result is that a person increasingly loses the ability to encounter different perspectives, then protection has begun to turn into control. The sad thing is that the person inside may not feel that they are being isolated. They may feel that they are being liberated, because for the first time in their life, everything seems clear. There are good people. There are bad people. There is truth. There is deception. There is us. There is them. There are no longer so many shades of gray. And for a mind exhausted by the complexity of life, that simplicity can bring a sense of relief. But life is rarely that simple. People are not entirely good or entirely bad. Someone can love us and still make mistakes. Someone can disagree with us and still be kind. A community can contain beautiful things and still have problems that need to be questioned. The ability to hold these contradictions is itself part of psychological maturity, because maturity does not mean finding a world without contradictions. It means learning to live with contradictions without needing to destroy half of the world in order to protect the other half. And so, an important sign of a healthy community is not that everyone is the same. It is whether people are allowed to be different. Can you disagree? Can you ask questions? Can you maintain friendships outside the group? Can you read a book that presents an opposing perspective? Can you say, perhaps we are not necessarily right? If the answer is yes, there is still room for freedom. But if every question is seen as betrayal, everyone outside is seen as dangerous, and every other source of information is considered toxic, then the final window is slowly closing. And once the outside world has been turned into a frightening place, the group no longer needs to hold you through force. Fear itself will keep you there. You begin to control yourself. You avoid other people on your own. You hide your thoughts. You eliminate the questions that make you uncomfortable. By then, control is no longer outside. It has moved inside. And this is where our journey becomes even deeper. Because once a person has been separated from their old sources of information, what happens next? If the outside world can no longer be trusted, if the group becomes the only place providing answers, then the group may also begin to change the way a person sees themselves. Names can change. Language can change. Daily routines can change. The past can be retold in a new way. And eventually, a person may begin to ask themselves, is the person I used to be really still me? That is the next door. Thought reform. When a person begins to forget who they once were, there is something strange about the human mind. We often think of our identity as something fixed. I am this person. I like this. I believe that. These are my friends. These are the things I have been through. This is my family. This is the story of my life. But what happens if layer by layer, those things begin to change so slowly that we barely notice? Perhaps one day you can still see yourself in the mirror, still hear your own voice, still remember your name, but the feeling of who I am no longer feels the way it once did. This is one of the deepest aspects of understanding psychological control within high-control groups. Change often does not begin by completely erasing the person you used to be. It begins by rewriting small parts of that person, one by one. A new name, a new way of dressing, a new daily routine, new words, new friends, things that are allowed to be said, things that should not be said, and gradually, a new way of looking at your own past. At first glance, Each individual change may seem harmless. A community may have a dress code. A group may have scheduled activities. An organization may have its own terminology. A community may have distinctive rituals. None of these things, by themselves, prove that a group is dangerous. What matters is the degree and function of the change. If these changes are freely chosen, if people can still retain their individual identity, ask questions, and leave at any time, then it may simply be part of a community's culture. But if each change is used to gradually distance a person from who they used to be, from their family, from their friends, from their previous values, while making them increasingly dependent on the group to know how they should live, then we are entering a more complicated psychological territory. Let us begin with language. Language does not merely help us communicate, it helps us think. When a group creates its own terminology, at first this may make members feel connected. Only people within the group understand these words. Only they know the deeper meanings behind them. A shared language creates the feeling. We understand something that outsiders do not. But over time, language can also shape the way a person interprets their own experiences. An emotion may be given a new name. A doubt may be defined as weak faith. Exhaustion may be called a lack of commitment. A desire to leave may be interpreted as failure. When the name changes, the way a person experiences that very same reality can change as well. And then there is time. The time to wake up, the time to eat, the time to work, the time to study, the time to pray, the time for group activities, the time to rest. When a person's schedule becomes increasingly structured by the community, their private time may gradually become smaller. This is important because time alone is not merely a period of rest. It is also a space for thinking, for remembering, for comparing, for asking yourself, is what I am doing really right for me? When a person is constantly busy, constantly participating, constantly surrounded by the community, they may have fewer opportunities to hear the voice within themselves again. And that inner voice, if it is drowned out for long enough, can sometimes become very quiet. Then comes external appearance, clothing, hairstyle, the way you greet people, the way you stand, the way you sit. Things that seem to belong merely to outward appearance can sometimes influence the way a person experiences themselves, because human beings do not experience the world only from within. We also recognize ourselves through external signals. When a person changes the way they dress, changes the way they speak, and changes the way they interact with others, they may gradually begin to feel that they are becoming a new person. This is not necessarily negative. Human beings naturally change throughout their lives. The problem appears when change is no longer a choice made independently, but becomes a condition for being accepted. If you must dress this way in order to be considered good, if you must speak this way in order to be considered enlightened, if you must give up those people in order to be considered loyal, then identity is no longer simply developing. It is being shaped from the outside, and perhaps the deepest part lies in the past. Human beings do not live only in the present. We tell ourselves a story about our lives. I used to be like this. I went through that. My family was like this. I used to dream of this. Those memories form part of our identity. If a system begins telling you that the person you used to be was wrong, foolish, weak, or not yet awakened, then gradually, you may begin to look at your past through the eyes of the system. Things that once made you proud become things to be ashamed of. People who once loved you become people who are holding you back. Choices that once belonged to you become mistakes. And the years before joining the group may come to be remembered as though they belonged to another life. This is where the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung becomes particularly worth reflecting upon. Jung devoted considerable attention to the process of individuation, the process of becoming a whole individual. in which a person gradually recognizes the different parts of their psyche and learns to live with them rather than completely dissolving themselves into the expectations of the collective. In that spirit, psychological maturity does not mean becoming a perfect copy of a community. It is the process of discovering, who am I truly? When I no longer need to play a role in order to be accepted. That is a very difficult question, because sometimes we do not realize that we are playing a role. We only know that everyone loves that role. A well-behaved member, a loyal person, someone who always agrees, someone who never asks questions, someone who is willing to sacrifice. And each time we perform that role, the community gives us a reward, recognition, until one day we want to stop, and we realize, if I no longer play this role, will they still love me? This can be a very painful moment, but it can also be a moment of awakening, because true identity does not need to be protected through obedience. A person can change without having to reject their entire past. They can learn a new belief without having to hate the old one. They can love a community while still retaining the right to disagree. And they can become a new version of themselves without having to erase the person who once existed. If you are listening tonight in the quiet, try thinking about yourself very gently. Where do the things you currently believe come from? Are your choices truly your own choices? Can you say no and still be loved? Can you change your mind without being seen as a traitor? And, most importantly, if one day all the voices around me became silent, would I still be able to hear the voice of my own? Perhaps the deepest form of freedom is not belonging nowhere. It is being able to belong somewhere without losing yourself. And once identity has begun to change, the tools that make that change endure can begin to appear. They are not always clear commands. Sometimes they are confessions, repetition, specialized language, sleep deprivation, rituals, public commitments, small sacrifices repeated until they become ordinary. Together, they form an invisible network of control, and that will be the next door we walk through. The invisible tools of mind control. The invisible tools of mind control. There are locks that do not need keys. There are doors that do not need anyone standing guard. And there are forms of control so powerful that, eventually, the person being controlled may no longer feel that they are being forced at all. They regulate their own words, alter their own thoughts, sacrifice on their own, stay awake late into the night, voluntarily confess private things, and sometimes convince themselves that all of these things are choices they have made for themselves. This is perhaps the most subtle and thought-provoking aspect of psychological control. When we talk about high control groups, we should not imagine that everything happens through cold, direct commands. Reality can be far more complicated. A system of control can be built from very small actions, repeated long enough until they become a natural part of everyday life. One of the first tools can be confession. Human beings naturally have a need to share. When we speak about things we have kept hidden, we can sometimes feel relieved. A healthy community can create a space where people are able to be honest with one another. But if those private things are collected, remembered, and later used as a means of applying pressure, confession has changed its nature. A secret once given in trust can become an invisible thread. A person may begin to think, "These people know too much about me. Could I really leave? What would happen if they knew I no longer believed?" And that fear can cause someone to keep themselves from leaving. Then there is loaded language designed to direct interpretation. Language does not simply describe the world, it helps us give names to what is happening inside us. A person who doubts may be called weak in faith. A person who disagrees may be called selfish. A person who wants to leave may be seen as a traitor. Conversely, obedience may be called maturity. Sacrifice may be called nobility. And complete trust in the leader may be called enlightenment. When the names change, emotions can change as well. You are no longer simply disagreeing. You begin to feel guilty for disagreeing. And this is the unsettling power of language. It can cause a person to judge themselves according to standards they had never used before. Then comes repetition. A sentence heard once may simply be a sentence, but a sentence heard every day, during meetings, rituals, sermons, conversations, and emotionally intense moments, can gradually become part of the inner world. We are the chosen ones. Outsiders do not understand. Only this path is right. When an idea appears everywhere, it can begin to feel familiar. And what is familiar is sometimes experienced by the mind as something trustworthy. But psychological control does not work only through words. It can also operate through the body. One example is sleep deprivation. Sleep is not merely a period of rest. It is directly connected to our ability to concentrate, regulate emotions, remember, and think clearly. When a person is repeatedly deprived of sleep, they may become more emotionally reactive, less capable of evaluating situations, and more likely to respond impulsively. So if a community regularly requires members to participate in activities that significantly reduce their time for rest, what deserves attention is not simply the busy schedule. It is this: does a person still have enough quiet space to think independently? Because a mind that is constantly exhausted can find it difficult to remain steady under collective pressure. Another more subtle tool is public commitment. Imagine standing in front of many people and declaring, "I will follow this path. I will never go back. I completely believe." At first, this may be nothing more than a statement. But after saying it publicly before the community, the mind may feel a tendency to maintain consistency between words and actions. If you later begin to doubt, part of you may think, "But I told everyone that I believed." And instead of changing the belief, people sometimes change the way they interpret reality in order to protect a consistent image of themselves. Then come small sacrifices: 1 hour a day, a small amount of money, a missed gathering, an old hobby, a friend, a vacation. No single sacrifice may be large enough to make you stop immediately. But little by little, things you once considered important begin to disappear. And because every step is so small, you may not realize how far you have gone. This is one of the most thought-provoking aspects of human psychology. We are not always changed by one enormous decision. Sometimes we are changed by hundreds of small decisions, each of which seems insignificant on its own. Rituals can also play an important role. Music, rhythm, synchronized movement, repeated phrases, a special environment, lighting, scent, actions performed together. All of these can create powerful emotional states and strengthen a sense of community. A healthy ritual can bring people together. But when ritual is combined with absolute obedience, it can become a means of reinforcing collective identity. You do not simply hear a message, you feel it with your body. You listen together, move together, repeat together. And in that moment, the boundary between I and we can begin to blur. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, this is particularly worth contemplating. Human beings are not made only of rational thoughts. We also contain deep emotional, symbolic, and unconscious layers. A powerful symbol, a repeated ritual, or a collective image can affect a person at a deeper level than ordinary arguments can. But this also reminds us that a healthy community needs to preserve space for the individual. You can participate in a ritual and still have the right not to participate. You can love a community and still have a life of your own. You can listen to a leader and still be allowed to say, "I may not agree." That is the difference between connection and control. Connection says, "Be here if you want to." Control says, "You must be here in order to belong." And perhaps the most important question is not, do these tools exist? But, are they being used to help people grow? Or to make people increasingly dependent? Because the same ritual can create connection. The same commitment can create responsibility. The same community can create love. But when these things are used to weaken a person's ability to choose, they begin to become invisible locks. And the most frightening part is that sometimes the lock is not held by someone else. It is held within our own minds. We censor ourselves. We correct our own words. We hide our doubts. We monitor ourselves. We ask, are they satisfied with me? And then, without anyone standing behind us, we begin to guard ourselves. That is the transition that leads us into the next part, invisible surveillance. When no one needs to watch anymore, because the member has learned to watch themselves. Invisible surveillance. When members begin controlling themselves, there is a very particular form of control that we can barely see. It does not need cameras. It does not need someone standing behind a door. It does not need commands repeated every day, because eventually, the person being controlled may begin to watch themselves. They ask themselves before speaking, am I allowed to say this? Before meeting someone, will they think I am doing something wrong? Before asking a question, if I ask this, will they think I lack faith? And before thinking a certain thought, am I not supposed to think this way? That is the moment when power has moved from the outside to the inside. At first, a community may simply establish clear rules, but over time, if a person is repeatedly reminded that they are being observed, evaluated, or maybe judged, the mind can learn to anticipate the gaze of others. And the strange thing is that, after a while, they no longer need anyone else to watch them. They have learned to look at themselves through the eyes of the community. Imagine a child growing up while constantly being told, do not do that, do not say that, other people will judge you. At first, the child changes their behavior only when an adult is present. But if those warnings are repeated often enough, the child may begin to ask, what will happen if I do something wrong? Even when no one is there, they may still feel an invisible gaze. In high-control psychological systems, a similar mechanism can emerge. Members know that their behavior may become known to others. They know about private things they once shared. They know who tends to report what. They know that people who ask questions may be scrutinized. And so they begin to regulate themselves, not because there is a command directly in front of them, but because the fear of consequences has become part of their thinking. What is especially striking is how effective this kind of control can be. A person may sit alone in a room and still feel that they need to behave according to a standard established by the group. No one needs to tell them, do not read that book. They think to themselves, perhaps I should not read it. No one tells them, do not meet your old friend. They think, if I meet them, will people misunderstand? No one asks, do you have doubts? But inside their own mind, the question has already appeared. If I have doubts, what does that say about me? This is a form of self-censorship, and when self-censorship becomes a habit, a person may begin to hide not only their behavior, but their own thoughts. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, this opens the door to a very profound question about the relationship between the ego and the shadow. Jung believed that the human psyche contains parts of which we are conscious, as well as parts pushed down into the unconscious. When a community repeatedly tells a person that certain emotions, thoughts, or desires are not allowed, that person may try to push those parts out of conscious awareness. The gradual escalation. When the absurd becomes normal, there are changes in life that happen very clearly. One day, we make a major decision, walk through a door, and know that we have entered a new chapter. But there are also changes that happen without a sound. There is no door closing. There is no single moment we can point to and say, this is when everything went wrong. They simply arrive little by little, so gradually, that when we finally look back, we are shocked by how far we have gone. In the psychology of high-control groups, gradual escalation is a particularly important mechanism to understand. A small request can pave the way for a larger one. A simple sacrifice can become a precedent for further sacrifices. And something that made a person uncomfortable yesterday may become something they consider completely normal today. Imagine standing at the top of a very long slope. If someone asked you to immediately walk all the way down, you might hesitate. But what if they asked you to take just one small step? You might agree. Then another step, and another. Each individual step seems harmless, but the distance between where you started and where you are now becomes greater and greater. That is what makes escalation so subtle. It does not necessarily begin with something extreme. It may begin with a very ordinary request. Stay a little longer. Join one more meeting. Don't see that person for a few days. Prove that you are truly committed. Can you make a small sacrifice for the community? None of these requests necessarily sounds like an attack on personal freedom. In fact, some may even be presented as expressions of dedication. But once a person has agreed once, agreeing a second time can become easier, because now they are not simply performing an action, they are protecting an image of themselves. I am a loyal person, and when loyalty becomes part of someone's identity, refusing a new request can make them feel as though they are betraying themselves. This is where human psychology becomes particularly fascinating. We tend to want our actions to remain consistent with what we have done before. If yesterday I said that I trusted this community, then today, when something makes me uncomfortable or suspicious, my mind may try to explain it rather than immediately question my previous belief. Maybe I don't understand yet. Maybe I need to try harder. Maybe this is a test. And so the new demand is accepted, not because the person suddenly became extreme, but because they are trying to keep the story they have built about themselves from falling apart. That is what makes gradual escalation so dangerous. No single step necessarily feels large enough to force us to stop. Each step is only slightly larger than the one before it. And human adaptation can happen in exactly the same way. What shocked us yesterday becomes familiar today. What makes us hesitate today may become an obligation tomorrow. And once an obligation becomes normal, refusing it can be interpreted as a sign of weakness. At that point, the demand is no longer simply a demand. It becomes a test of loyalty. Do you really believe? Are you willing to sacrifice? If you truly belong with us, why won't you do this? This is a crucial transformation. At first, an action is judged based on the action itself. But later, that action is used to judge the worth of the person. Not complying no longer means, I disagree. It begins to mean, I'm not good enough. I'm not loyal. I'm not mature enough. I'm betraying everyone. And when a small action becomes tied to a person's sense of worth, the pressure becomes much stronger. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, we can examine this phenomenon through the relationship between the individual and the collective. Human beings naturally have a need to belong. We need community, recognition, and the feeling that our lives have meaning. But when the need to belong becomes so powerful that a person must sacrifice their ability to think and judge independently just to maintain their place within the group, the price of belonging begins to become too high. A person may gradually begin to live according to the question, who does the group want me to become? Instead of, what truly aligns with my conscience? That is the shift from autonomy to identification. And once identification becomes deep enough, a person may begin defending things they once opposed themselves, not because they are being dishonest, but because the human mind has an extraordinary capacity to adapt. We adapt to our environment. We adapt to language. We adapt to rules. Adaptation to things that initially make us uncomfortable. It is an essential ability for survival. But that same ability to adapt can also cause us to become comfortable with things that, from the outside, might seem deeply unusual. Think about the temperature of a room. If the temperature changes very quickly, you notice it immediately. But if the temperature changes little by little, your body may adapt before you even realize that the environment has become completely different. The human mind can sometimes work the same way. Extremism rarely enters through the front door with a loud knock. It may arrive through very quiet footsteps, a new rule, a new boundary, a new commitment, a new sacrifice, a new way of looking at outsiders, a new way of looking at yourself. And one day, a person may look back and realize, I would never have accepted this before, but now, I am living with it. That may be a moment worth pausing over, not to blame yourself, not to feel ashamed, but to ask a question, what changed? Because recognizing that something has changed is not a failure. On the contrary, it may be the first sign of self-awareness. And perhaps this is also something Jung wanted us to consider when examining our inner lives. Human beings need the ability to face themselves, even when the answer is uncomfortable. Not every community is dangerous. Not every demand is manipulation. Not every sacrifice means a loss of freedom. A healthy community can encourage people to move beyond their comfort zones. The difference lies in whether you still have the right to say no. Can you say, no, this is not right for me, and still be respected? Can you change your mind without being punished? Can you ask questions without being humiliated? Can you leave without being turned into an enemy? If the answer is yes, growth can still take place within freedom. But if every step forward is used to force you to take another step, choice gradually disappears. And when you look back at that journey, the most frightening thing may not be the final extreme demand. It may be the hundreds of small demands that made it seem normal. Tonight, when everything around you has become quiet, perhaps you can ask yourself one simple question. Is there something in my life that I once refused to accept, but now accept simply because I have become accustomed to it? You do not need to answer immediately. Just let the question remain there, because sometimes one honest question can interrupt an entire chain of habits we never realized we had formed. And when a person begins asking questions, another paradox appears. If the reality in front of them no longer fits the belief they have sacrificed so much to protect, will they change the belief? Or will they find another way to explain the reality? That is where we enter a deeper territory of human psychology, cognitive dissonance and sunk cost. Why the more we invest in a belief, the harder it can become to let it go. Cognitive dissonance and sunk cost. Why we struggle to let go of beliefs. There are moments in life when the hardest thing is not seeing the truth, but accepting that the truth requires us to change a story we have believed for a very long time, especially when a belief is no longer simply an idea, but has become part of our identity, our relationships, the years we have lived, the sacrifices we have made, and the image we hold of ourselves. Imagine someone who has spent many years devoted to a community. They have given their time, money, old relationships, personal opportunities, and perhaps even things that once made them happy. Throughout those years, they believed they were moving in the right direction. Then one day, a truth appears, something they cannot easily explain, a promise that was never fulfilled, an action that contradicts the principles the group once claimed to uphold. A person they trusted turns out to be far less perfect than the image that had been constructed around them. And in that moment, the mind faces a painful choice. Was I wrong to believe? Or maybe there is another explanation for what happened. This is where the concept of cognitive dissonance becomes especially important. Cognitive dissonance occurs when our beliefs, thoughts, or actions conflict with one another. Human beings generally dislike that state of psychological tension. We want the world to make sense. We want to believe that our choices have reasons. We want the image we have of ourselves to remain coherent. So when reality conflicts with our beliefs, the mind may try to reduce that discomfort, not always by changing the belief, sometimes by changing the way we interpret reality. A failure may become a lesson. A prophecy that did not come true may be explained as the timing was not right. A suspicious action by a leader may be interpreted as a test. Someone who leaves the group may be described as not mature enough. These explanations may sometimes be reasonable. Life is genuinely complicated. and one failed prediction does not automatically prove that an entire system is false. The important question lies elsewhere. Is a person still allowed to consider the possibility that their belief might be wrong? If the answer is no, cognitive dissonance can become a psychological lock, because every time contradictory evidence appears, the mind finds a way to protect the existing system. And the more it protects that system, the harder the belief becomes to challenge. This is where sunk cost enters the picture. A sunk cost is a resource that has already been spent and cannot be recovered. In life, that might include time, money, effort, opportunities, relationships, or years that have already passed. A very human thought often appears, "But I've already invested so much in this." The statement sounds reasonable, but what has been lost in the past cannot automatically become a reason to continue investing in something that no longer fits the present. Yet emotions do not always follow that logic. If I have spent 10 years committed to a belief, admitting that I may have been wrong does not simply mean changing an idea. It may force me to confront a much more painful question. Then, what did those 10 years mean? If I sacrificed friendships for the community, can I admit that those sacrifices may not have been necessary? If I distanced myself from my family because of a belief, can I admit that I went too far? If I defended someone against everyone else, can I admit that I placed my trust in the wrong person? Sometimes, people continue walking down a path, not because the road ahead is better, but because turning back would force them to confront too much pain behind them. And this is where the psychology of a person can become extremely complex. They are not simply protecting a belief, they are protecting a memory of themselves. From Carl Gustav Jung's perspective, this raises a profound question about the ego and identity. When a person becomes too strongly identified with a belief system, questioning that system can feel like questioning the self. "I believe this," gradually becomes, "This is who I am." And when a belief becomes part of identity, changing that belief can feel like an identity crisis. Jung placed particular importance on the process of individuation, the process through which a person gradually becomes more fully themselves by confronting different parts of their psyche rather than completely dissolving into external expectations. From this perspective, maturity does not necessarily mean always being right. Perhaps maturity also means being able to say, "I used to believe this, but now I see it differently." That statement does not make a person weaker. It shows that they can change without having to reject their entire identity. A person can say, "I truly believed. I truly loved this community. I truly thought I was doing the right thing. And now I realize that I need to rethink it." Not everything in the past becomes meaningless simply because a belief has changed. Those years are still part of the story. Those relationships once had meaning. Those experiences can still teach us something. Perhaps this is the healthier way to escape the trap of sunk cost. You do not have to prove that your entire past was wrong in order to earn the right to move into the future. You do not need to hate your former self in order to become a new version of yourself. You also do not need to deny the good things that once existed in order to acknowledge that a system may have become unhealthy. That distinction is extremely important, because when a person believes they must choose between two extremes, everything was right or everything was fake, they can become trapped. But life often exists somewhere in between. A community may have once provided genuine friendship and later become controlling. A leader may once have been inspiring and later abuse their power. A belief may have helped someone survive a difficult period and later stop being right for them. People change. Beliefs change. Life changes. And we have the right to change with it. Perhaps tonight, as you lie down and allow your thoughts to slow, ask yourself one gentle question. Is there something I am still holding on to simply because I have already invested too much in it? You do not need to answer immediately. Let the question remain still, because sometimes awakening does not begin with finding a new answer. It begins by allowing yourself to ask a question you were once afraid to ask. And if a belief system has become a place where every question is treated as betrayal, then we move into an even deeper layer of control. Because at that point, it is no longer simply about making people believe. It is about building a system in which no evidence is allowed to make them question. Agreement becomes enlightenment. Opposition becomes blindness. Failure becomes a test. And every piece of evidence against the system is reinterpreted in a way that protects the system. That is the next door in our journey. When belief becomes a system that cannot be disproved, there comes a subtle point in the life of a belief when it stops being simply something a person chooses to believe and becomes a framework used to explain everything happening around them. At that point, a person no longer asks, "Is this true?" Instead, they begin asking, "How can this still be true?" The two questions sound similar, but there is a vast difference between them. One opens the door to discovery, the other can close it. A healthy belief system does not necessarily have to change constantly. It can have deeply held principles and strong convictions, but it needs one essential quality: the ability to be questioned. Because if an idea is truly strong, it does not need to fear sincere questions. Imagine someone begins questioning the community they belong to. They ask, "Is this really true?" If the answer is, "Keep learning. Look into it more," the door remains open. But if the answer is, "Only someone who has not awakened would ask that," then the question is no longer treated as an honest search for truth. It becomes a sign of being misguided. And this is a very important shift, because from that moment on, evidence is no longer used to test the belief. The belief begins to determine how evidence should be interpreted. If an event supports the system, it is considered proof that the system is correct. If an event contradicts the system, it is explained in another way so that the system can remain protected. If someone succeeds, it is because the belief led them to success. If someone fails, perhaps they were not devoted enough. If a prediction comes true, it is evidence. If the prediction fails, perhaps the listener misunderstood it. In this way, almost any outcome can be interpreted as confirmation of the belief. And when that happens, the system becomes extremely difficult to disprove. What is worth remembering is that this mechanism does not exist only in extreme groups. To varying degrees, human beings naturally tend to defend the things they already believe. We often prefer information that confirms our worldview and feel uncomfortable when confronted with information that challenges it. But within a highly controlling system, this tendency can be pushed much further. It is no longer, "You might be wrong." It becomes, "If you think you are wrong, that is proof that you do not understand enough." This is a very deep psychological trap, because if doubt itself is used as evidence that the system is correct, the person inside the system has almost no way to test it from within. You doubt? You need to believe more. You disagree? You need to study more. You want to leave? You are being manipulated by the outside world. You present evidence? That evidence is dismissed because it comes from an untrustworthy source. Every path leads back to the same conclusion, and that is when belief can become a closed system. From the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung, this raises a profound question about the relationship between the I and the mental image a person creates of the world. Jung was deeply interested in the danger of becoming overly identified with the psychological images and patterns we carry within ourselves. When an idea becomes the absolute center of identity, we may stop seeing it as merely an idea. We begin to see it as ourselves. "I believe this" gradually becomes, "I am the person who believes this." And when a person feels threatened by a question, they may defend the belief with all their psychological strength, not because they are stupid, not because they are incapable of thinking, but because the question is no longer simply a question about an idea. It has become the question, "If this is not true, then who am I?" This is precisely why absolute belief systems can become so powerful. They do not merely provide answers. They provide identity. They provide community. They provide meaning. They provide an explanation of the past. They provide a way of understanding the present. And they may even provide a story about the future. When all of these elements are connected into one system, questioning one part can feel as though the entire structure is beginning to collapse. So the mind tries to protect it, like a house in which every room is connected to the others. If you touch one wall, it can feel as though the entire house is shaking. But there is something important to remember. The ability to change your mind is not a weakness. In fact, it is one of the clearest signs of intellectual maturity. A person can say, "I used to believe this. After learning more, I changed my mind. I'm not certain. I don't know." These 4 sentences may sound ordinary, but they contain something precious. Humility before reality. Because reality has no obligation to fit what we want to believe. And sometimes the most honest answer is not right or wrong. It is, "I don't know yet." For a system that cannot be disproved, this statement can be extremely difficult to accept, because "I don't know yet" leaves open the possibility that tomorrow we may discover something new. But that uncertainty is precisely what allows independent thinking to survive. Think about a healthy community. A person can question its leadership. They can read different sources of information. They can speak with people outside the community. They can change their opinion. They can admit that a decision they made in the past was wrong. And most importantly, they can say, "I disagree," without becoming an enemy. That is a sign of psychological freedom. Because freedom does not mean that everyone must agree with one another. Freedom means that disagreement does not cause you to lose the right to be yourself. Perhaps that is why one of the most valuable questions we can ask about any belief is, "What could make me change my mind?" If the answer is nothing, then pause for a moment. Not to immediately conclude that the belief is wrong, but to recognize that a belief that allows no possibility of revision can become very difficult to distinguish from absolute certainty. And this is also where we need to be gentle with ourselves. If someone has lived inside such a system, recognizing contradictions does not always bring immediate relief. Sometimes it brings fear, because when the old framework begins to crack, a person may feel that they are not only losing answers, they are losing their entire world. But that emptiness does not necessarily mean the end. Sometimes it is where a person begins to find themselves again. And perhaps this is one of the most beautiful things psychology can teach us. Not every empty space needs to be filled immediately with a new belief. Sometimes we simply need enough courage to sit quietly with uncertainty, to say, "I don't know," to listen, to observe, to think, and to allow truth to have the power to change us. As night falls, you might carry one gentle question with you into sleep. Which belief in my life allows me to question itself? If the answer brings you peace, hold on to that peace. If the question leaves you confused, that is okay too. Because sometimes confusion is a sign that the mind is opening a new door. And beyond that door lies an even deeper territory. A place where power does not only influence thoughts or beliefs, but begins to reach into the most private parts of human life. Family, love, the body, and the relationships we once believed no one had the right to control. That is where we will continue our journey. Family, love, and the body. The deepest places of power. There are parts of life that we often believe other people cannot control. Our private room, love, family, our body, what we eat, how we rest, who we choose to be with, and the things we only reveal when we feel completely safe. But the history of human psychology reveals a profound paradox. Power often becomes most deeply rooted when it no longer simply tells us what to do, but begins defining whom we should love, whom we should trust, whom we should live with, and even who we are allowed to become. At first, this may not look like control. It may begin with a piece of advice. That person isn't really good for you. Your family outside the group doesn't understand you. You should spend more time with the community. People who truly love you would make the same choices we do, one sentence at a time. These statements may sound harmless. Sometimes, they may even be spoken with genuine concern. But when those suggestions gradually become boundaries that cannot be crossed, something else has begun to happen. The power to make personal choices is moving from within the individual to somewhere outside of them. And love is one of the places where people are most vulnerable. Because human beings do not simply need to be loved. We are also afraid of losing love. A person may endure tremendous pressure simply to avoid losing someone they have come to see as their only family. Therefore, if a community can control a person's sense of belonging, it can exert enormous influence over their most private decisions. To be loved, you must be loyal. To stay, you must sacrifice. To be accepted, you must live this way. At that point, love is no longer entirely an act of free giving, a single moment, a question that was never answered, a feeling that never quite made sense. And years later, those small fragments may return with a new meaning. This is why the psychological development of a second-generation member can be so complex. They may love their family deeply while simultaneously questioning the world in which they were raised. They may feel grateful for the community and still wonder whether they were ever truly given a choice. They may fear leaving not only because they could lose their beliefs, but because leaving could mean losing the people they love most. And that creates a particularly painful dilemma. If I choose myself, am I betraying my family? For someone raised inside a closed belief system, independence may not feel like independence. It may feel like rejection. Curiosity may feel like disloyalty. Growing up may feel like abandoning the people who raised them. And this is where the distinction between inheritance and choice becomes essential. Every generation passes something to the next. Language, stories, values, traditions, memories, beliefs. There is nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, human civilization depends upon it. But a healthy inheritance leaves room for revision. A parent can say, "This is what I believe," and you are free to decide what you believe when you are old enough. A controlling system may instead communicate, "This is what you are." And questioning it means you are rejecting us. The difference may seem small. Psychologically, it is enormous. Because the first allows identity to develop. The second can make identity feel predetermined. And when a person's identity is predetermined before they are old enough to examine it, the journey toward individuation can become much more difficult. Jung's concept of individuation becomes especially relevant here. Individuation is not simply becoming independent from everyone else. It is the gradual process of becoming a whole person, recognizing one's own thoughts, emotions, contradictions, values, desires, fears, and unconscious patterns. For a young person raised within a highly controlling environment, that process may create an internal conflict. Part of them may say, "This is my family. These are the people I love." Another part may quietly ask, "But what if I want something different?" And sometimes that second voice begins very softly, perhaps through a book, a friendship, a conversation, a question at school, a relationship, a moment of seeing another way of living. Suddenly, the person discovers something they had never been encouraged to consider. There are other ways to understand the world. That realization does not automatically mean their upbringing was entirely wrong. It simply means the world is larger than the version they were originally given. And discovering that can be both liberating and terrifying. Because when your entire identity has been built around one worldview, discovering alternatives can feel like standing at the edge of a vast ocean without knowing how to swim. You may feel excitement. You may feel guilt. You may feel fear. You may even feel grief. Grief for the childhood you had. Grief for the choices you never knew existed. Grief for relationships that may change if you begin thinking differently. And sometimes, grief for the certainty you once had. This is why leaving a highly controlling environment is not always as simple as discovering that something is wrong and walking away. A person may be leaving behind an entire psychological ecosystem, their family, their language, their traditions, their friendships, their daily routines, their understanding of morality, their concept of love, their idea of who they are, and perhaps most painfully, their idea of where they belong. For a second-generation member, this can be even more complicated, because they may not feel that they are leaving a group, they may feel as though they are leaving home, and that distinction matters. A person can intellectually recognize that a belief system is restrictive and still emotionally long for the people and memories associated with it. They can disagree with the community and still love their parents. They can reject certain teachings and still treasure childhood memories. They can build a different life without needing to declare that every person from their past was evil. Human beings are rarely that simple. And perhaps this is one of the most important lessons we can take from psychology. Healing does not always require turning the past into an enemy. Sometimes healing means learning how to hold two truths at once. This was my home, and this home did not give me everything I needed. These people loved me, and some of their beliefs hurt me. I learned valuable things here, and I also need to learn things beyond here. Those statements can coexist. The mind does not always need to choose one extreme or the other. And perhaps that is especially important for people who grew up believing that the world was divided into absolute categories: good and evil, us and them, loyal and disloyal, pure and corrupted, believer and outsider. Growing beyond such a worldview may require learning to tolerate something much more difficult: complexity. A parent can be loving and mistaken. A community can offer belonging and still have unhealthy dynamics. A tradition can contain wisdom and still contain limitations. A person can leave without becoming a bad person, and a person can stay connected to their family without surrendering their independence. That kind of complexity can feel uncomfortable at first, but psychological maturity often begins where certainty ends. Perhaps this is why children who grow up inside restrictive systems sometimes experience a profound turning point when they finally realize, I am allowed to examine what I was taught, not necessarily reject it, not necessarily accept it, simply examine it. That single permission can be transformative, because a belief chosen freely is psychologically different from a belief that cannot be questioned. A value chosen after reflection is different from a value imposed through fear, and belonging becomes much healthier when it survives disagreement. So perhaps the question for someone raised inside a closed system is not, was everything I was taught wrong? A more useful question may be, which parts of what I was taught still belong to me? Some may remain, some may change, some may disappear, and some may return years later with a completely different meaning. That is part of becoming an individual. You do not have to erase your childhood to create your future. You do not have to hate your parents to become independent. You do not have to destroy every memory to reclaim your identity. You simply need enough inner space to ask, what do I believe when I am finally allowed to choose? And perhaps tonight, as you let the world become quiet around you, you can sit with that question gently, not as an accusation, not as a rebellion, just as an invitation. Which parts of me were chosen by me, and which parts were simply given to me? You do not need an answer tonight. Sometimes the first step toward freedom is simply realizing that the question is yours to ask. And when a second-generation member begins asking those questions, another difficult reality may emerge. What happens when the family itself becomes the mechanism that keeps the belief system alive? What happens when parents, children, siblings, marriage, and loyalty become intertwined with obedience? And what happens when choosing your own path means risking the love of the people who raised you? That brings us to another deeply human dimension of control. When leaving means losing the people you love, it is not to be influenced at all. It is to be able to recognize the influences acting upon you. And perhaps that is one of the most subtle forms of psychological freedom, to be able to stand in the middle of a crowd and still hear your own inner voice, to be moved by a song without assuming that the emotion itself is proof, to feel connected without losing your individuality, to participate without believing that participation is the only measure of loyalty, because a human being can belong to a community without surrendering the right to remain an individual. And perhaps this is where Jung's idea of individuation becomes especially meaningful. Individuation does not mean becoming isolated from everyone else. It means gradually becoming conscious of who you are, what you believe, what you feel, and which parts of yourself have been shaped by forces outside your awareness. Sometimes, that process begins with a very small realization. I felt something before I understood why I felt it. Maybe the room made you emotional. Maybe the music made you feel connected. Maybe everyone around you seemed certain, and their certainty made you feel certain too. There is nothing wrong with those feelings, but feelings do not always tell us what is true. They tell us what we are experiencing, and learning to distinguish between those two things is part of psychological maturity. So tonight, as you allow your mind to become quieter, perhaps you can gently ask yourself, which emotions in my life feel completely like my own, and which ones might have been shaped by the environment around me? You do not need to reject anything. You do not need to distrust every tradition. You do not need to question every community. You simply need to become a little more conscious. Because consciousness does not destroy meaning, it gives you the freedom to choose what meaning truly belongs to you. And once we begin to understand how deeply the environment can shape the mind, another question naturally appears. What happens when a person leaves the environment? What happens when they step outside the community? The rituals, the rules, the language, and the identity that once gave their entire life structure. Freedom sounds beautiful from the outside, but for someone who has lived inside a closed system for years, freedom can initially feel frightening, because when every answer disappears, the silence can be overwhelming. And that brings us to the next stage of our journey, leaving the system. When freedom feels like emptiness. Freedom is the ability to recognize that you are being influenced and still retain the right to choose. And when we step outside the world of rituals, sounds, and symbols, we encounter another chapter of history that is even more difficult to sleep through. Real cases. Communities that descended into extremism, and the lessons history has left us about power, obedience, group pressure, and the attraction of charismatic leaders. That is where we will continue our journey. From Jonestown to NXIVM, historical lessons on how people can become deeply drawn into a system of control they never thought they would enter. From Jonestown to NXIVM, historical lessons on human control. There are stories in history that make it difficult to sleep. Not because they are completely unfamiliar, but because they force us to look at something deeply human, our capacity to trust. We often imagine that great tragedies must begin with exceptionally dangerous people, but the history of high-control communities suggests something more complicated. People who enter such systems often begin with very ordinary needs: the desire to be loved, the desire for community, the search for meaning, or the need for guidance when life becomes uncertain. And that is precisely why the stories of Jonestown and NXIVM deserve to be examined not only as historical events, but as mirrors reflecting the psychology of human beings. Jonestown was associated with Jim Jones and the People's Temple. In 1978, more than 900 people died at Jonestown, Guyana, in an event that became one of the most haunting collective tragedies of the 20th century. But if we look only at the final moment, we may miss the most important part of the story. The road leading there did not happen in a single day. Before Jonestown came years of building community, belief, loyalty, and power. A charismatic leader may begin by speaking about hope, justice, and a better world. People who find comfort in that message may feel that they have finally encountered someone who understands them. That is deeply human. Human beings are always searching for meaning. But the problem begins when a person becomes more than an inspiring leader and gradually becomes the only source of truth. At that point, The leader's words are no longer simply advice. They become the standard by which reality itself is judged. People outside the group are no longer merely different. They may become enemies. Questions are no longer simply questions. They become signs of betrayal, and each small step can make the world inside the group increasingly closed. Through the lens of Carl Gustav Jung, we can see here a profound question about projection. Human beings often project their inner images onto other people. We may see a leader as a savior, a father, a guide who knows the way, or even as an almost superhuman figure, but the real-life leader is still a human being. When a community projects too much psychological power onto one individual, that person may gradually come to be seen as something greater than who they actually are. And when someone is perceived as incapable of being wrong, power becomes especially dangerous. From Jonestown, we can turn to another case with a very different form, NXIVM. NXIVM was established as a personal development and professional training organization, but later became the center of a criminal case involving Keith Raniere and a system of control and exploitation of members. Raniere was convicted of multiple serious crimes. What is important is that these two cases were not identical in their context, structure, or methods. And that difference matters, because it shows us that psychological control does not necessarily have a single form. It can appear in the form of religion. It can appear in the form of self-development. It can appear as an idealistic community. It can begin with promises of healing, success, enlightenment, or becoming a better version of yourself. The common factor is not the label. It lies in how power is organized and how a person's autonomy gradually becomes restricted. A person may begin with a course, then join another program, then share private information, then make increasingly significant commitments. Each individual step may be explainable, but when we look at the entire path, we begin to see how much dependence has changed. This is something that research on obedience and social pressure also helps us understand. The famous work of Stanley Milgram on obedience and Solomon Asch on conformity became important milestones in the history of social psychology. They do not prove that everyone will blindly obey authority, but they reveal a more uncomfortable truth. Social context can strongly influence human judgment and behavior. When someone is alone, they may say, "This is not right," but when they stand in a room where everyone else is saying, "This is completely normal," their certainty may begin to weaken, not because they suddenly lose their ability to think, but because human beings are social creatures. We look to others to understand what is happening. If everyone around us remains calm in the face of something frightening, we may wonder whether we are overreacting. If everyone believes, we may begin to wonder whether we are the only person who does not understand. That is the power of group pressure. And when that pressure combines with isolation, emotional dependence, leadership authority, and fear of rejection, it can create an environment in which maintaining independent judgment becomes increasingly difficult. But there is something very important we must remember when looking at stories such as Jonestown or NXIVM. We should not reduce the victims to people who were stupid or weak. That perspective is far too simple. It makes us think, "That could never happen to me." But that very confidence can cause us to overlook the small warning signs in our own lives. An intelligent person can still be persuaded. An educated person can still experience pressure. A strong person can still fear losing their community. And someone who was once deeply independent can still become dependent when their environment changes gradually. Because the problem does not exist only within the individual. It exists within the relationship between the individual and the system, and perhaps that is the deepest lesson history leaves us. We do not need to fear every community. We do not need to distrust every leader. What we need to protect is our ability to ask questions. A healthy community can tolerate disagreement. A healthy leader does not need to become the absolute source of truth. A healthy system does not need to isolate its members from every outside voice. And a healthy relationship does not say, "If you love me, you have to listen to me." It says, You have the right to think differently from me. Tonight, as we look back at these historical stories, perhaps we do not need to ask, how could those people believe that much? A deeper question is, what small steps could cause any human being to gradually lose the ability to say no? Because when we understand that question, we do not only understand history, we understand ourselves. And sometimes, awakening does not begin with leaving a place. It begins with a very small moment, a person sitting alone in silence and realizing, I have the right to ask questions. From that moment, a door may begin to open. But the first door of awakening does not always lead directly to freedom. It leads to doubt, a small question, a small contradiction, a feeling that something no longer fits. And if that person is patient enough to listen to that voice instead of immediately silencing it, a new journey can begin. Silent doubt. The moment a person begins to awaken, awakening rarely begins with a thunderclap. It does not necessarily arrive one morning when a person suddenly opens their eyes and says, "Everything I ever believed was wrong." In psychological life, profound transformations are often much quieter. They begin with something very small, almost insignificant, a sentence that makes us wonder, a rule that no longer seems as convincing as it once did, an event that does not match what we were taught, or simply a moment when a question appears inside us. What if things are not completely the way they say they are? And that question may remain. It is not loud. It does not demand an immediate answer. It simply rests somewhere deep within the mind. Through the lens of Carl Gustav Jung, we can see this moment as part of the journey back to the self. Jung devoted considerable attention to the process through which people gradually distinguish between their authentic selves and the images, roles, and beliefs they have absorbed from the world around them. A person may live for many years through an identity that was given to them without ever realizing that another part of themselves is still waiting to be heard. And sometimes, that part begins to speak through a question. Is this really what I believe? At first, people often try to push that question away, because doubt can be frightening. When a belief has become the foundation of someone's life, questioning it does not feel like questioning an idea. It can feel like questioning their family, their friends, their community, and even their entire past. A person may tell themselves, maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe I don't understand enough. Maybe the problem is with me. This is one reason awakening rarely happens all at once. The mind has a very natural tendency to preserve consistency. When new information conflicts with an existing belief system, people often experience discomfort, and rather than changing their entire worldview, we sometimes try to explain the new information in a way that still fits what we already believe. But contradictions do not always disappear. One question may be buried, then another appears, and one day a person may realize that they have an entire secret archive inside their mind, not a physical box, but a place where they keep the things they once witnessed but were afraid to say out loud. A leader's expression, an unreasonable decision, a friend being treated unfairly, an explanation that never quite made sense, a rule that applied to one person but not another. These things can remain buried for a very long time, but the human mind has a strange ability. It can remember things that consciousness deliberately tries to forget. And at some point, those seemingly disconnected fragments begin to connect. A person may sit alone at night and suddenly realize, wait, this happened before. Then another memory appears, and another, not one isolated moment, but a pattern. That may be when doubt begins to become clearer. But what is important is that awakening does not necessarily mean immediate resistance. Sometimes, a person who is awakening simply begins to observe more carefully. They begin listening instead of immediately believing. They begin comparing words with actions. They begin noticing things they once ignored. If a community claims to respect freedom, are its members actually allowed to leave? If a system says that everyone is equal, are people who ask questions treated the same way as those who agree? If a leader says they do not need power, Why must every major decision still go through them? These questions do not always have easy answers, but simply asking them is already a change, because in a closed system, power often does not only control what people are allowed to do, it can also control which questions people believe they are allowed to ask. And so, the first question can sometimes be the first sign of freedom. Jung has a frequently cited statement: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This idea appears in The Meaning of Psychology for Modern Man, collected in The Symbolic Life. The idea fits the journey of awakening particularly well. What we fail to recognize can continue influencing us without our conscious awareness. When a person begins recognizing the fears, needs, and beliefs that are influencing them, they gain an opportunity to see those forces more clearly, not to hate themselves, not to reject their past, but to begin choosing. And that distinction is important. Awakening is not always about destroying. Sometimes, awakening is simply about distinguishing. This is what I was taught. This is what I experienced. This is what I truly believe. Those three things may be the same, but they may also be completely different. A psychologically mature person does not necessarily have to reject everything they were taught. They can keep the things that were good, while reclaiming their right to evaluate them for themselves. That is a very quiet form of freedom. No shouting, no fighting. No need to prove to everyone that you are right. Just the ability to sit in silence and say, "I want to think about this for myself." But this stage can also be deeply painful, because when someone begins questioning the system, they may feel alone. Friends who once understood them may no longer understand. Family members may object. The community may interpret the change as betrayal, and the person who is awakening may find themselves standing between two worlds. One old world still calls them by the identity they once had. One new world does not yet have a clear shape. The space between those two worlds can be frightening, but it is also within that space that an individual identity can begin to emerge. No longer simply, "Other people tell me who I am," but gradually, "I am discovering who I am." Perhaps that is one of the deepest stages of the individuation process described by Jung. A person gradually becoming themselves, not by separating completely from the world, but by learning to recognize their own voice among the many voices that have lived inside their mind. And if you are listening to these words tonight, perhaps you can gently look inward as well. Is there something you once believed simply because everyone around you believed it? Is there a question you have repeatedly told yourself, "Don't think about that"? Is there a memory you tried to forget but that still occasionally returns? Do not rush to answer. Let those questions rest quietly, because genuine awakening does not need to happen quickly. A seed does not need to be pulled out of the ground to prove that it is growing. It simply needs time. The human mind is much the same. Sometimes, a small question held long enough can become a doorway, but after seeing that doorway, a more difficult question appears. If I truly begin to see the truth, what will I have to do with my life? And that is where we move into the next part of our journey. Leaving occult freedom does not end when you walk away. There is a moment that an outsider might think is the ending. A person walks through a door, leaves the community that once represented their entire world, steps onto the road outside, looks back, and thinks, "Finally, I am free." But sometimes, freedom does not begin with relief. It begins with silence, emptiness, and a fear that is difficult to name. Because leaving a cult or a high-control community is not simply about leaving a physical place. It can mean leaving behind an entire network of relationships, a way of life, a language, a belief system, and even a version of yourself that existed for many years. To an outsider, an open door may look like freedom, but to the person walking through it, the outside world can sometimes feel frighteningly vast. Inside the old world, they were constantly told what to do, what to believe, whom to love, whom to avoid, and what would happen if they stepped away from the path. When those answers disappear, something strange happens. The freedom to choose, which they once longed for, can suddenly become a burden. Now I have to decide for myself. But how do I decide? Who can I trust? Where should I live? What work should I do? How should I dress? Whom should I love? Am I allowed to say no? And beneath all of those questions, who am I if I am no longer one of them? That question reaches into the deepest part of identity. Carl Gustav Jung was deeply interested in the journey of becoming oneself. In Jungian terms, this journey is connected to individuation, the process through which a person gradually differentiates themselves from roles, images, and patterns with which they have become overly identified. A person can live for a very long time through an identity that was given to them. I am a member of this community. I am someone who believes this. I am someone who lives according to these principles. When all of that disappears, the ego can feel as though it is standing inside an empty room, and that empty room can be frightening. This is why we should not look at someone who has just left a controlling system and simply ask, now that you're free, why aren't you happy? Because freedom does not always bring peace immediately. Sometimes, the first experience of freedom is disorientation. A person may lose their friends. They may lose contact with family. They may lose their job. They may lose their home. They may lose the purpose that once made every morning meaningful. And sometimes they lose the people they once believed would remain beside them for the rest of their lives. This is a form of grief. Not grief for one individual, but grief for an entire world. They may miss the shared meals, the songs, the gatherings, the friendships, the beautiful moments. And this is something that can be difficult for outsiders to understand. A person can know that a system harmed them and still miss it. Two truths can exist at the same time. I know that place was not good for me, and I still miss the people I loved there. There is no contradiction in those two statements, because memory does not function like a courtroom. It does not divide everything neatly into good and bad. A place can contain both love and pain. A person may have received genuine care from people they later had to leave behind. A childhood can contain beautiful memories, even when the belief system surrounding it was deeply problematic. Accepting that complexity can be part of recovery. And then something else happens. The old voice may continue to follow the person who left. There is no longer anyone standing in front of them giving orders. But inside their mind, a voice may still say, "You are doing something wrong. You will be punished. You are betraying us. You are not good enough. You cannot survive on your own. No one outside truly loves you." After leaving, those voices can still follow a person, even when they are hundreds or thousands of miles away from the place they once called home. This is one of the most subtle aspects of psychological control. It can move from the outside to the inside. At first, other people control you. Then, you learn to control yourself. And eventually, even when no one is watching, you can still hear that voice. But from a Jungian perspective, this can also be where a new journey begins. Because what has been placed in the unconscious does not necessarily have to control us forever. When a person can look at that inner voice and say, "This is a fear I learned. This is a belief that was given to me. This is not necessarily the truth," then a small distance begins to appear between the person and the person's thoughts. That distance is deeply important, because you are not every thought that appears in your mind. You are not every fear. You are not every judgment that someone else has ever placed upon you. There may be a part of you that is still afraid, but at the same time, there can be another part that is learning to observe that fear. And that observing self can become the starting point of freedom. Leaving can also mean learning how to do ordinary things all over again. Choosing your own clothes, deciding your own schedule, choosing your own friends, saying no, going somewhere without asking for permission, buying something you want without feeling guilty, asking questions. Things that seem small to other people can carry enormous meaning for someone who once lived in a highly controlled environment. These are acts of reclaiming personal autonomy. They do not have to begin with a revolution. They can be as simple as, "Today, I want to drink tea. I want to read this book. I don't want to attend this gathering. I don't agree with this." Every small choice is a brick, and over time, those bricks can rebuild a home within you, a home where, this time, you hold the key. Perhaps this is one of the most beautiful meanings of returning to yourself. It is not about becoming an entirely new person. It is about meeting again the parts of yourself that were once forgotten. The child who was curious, the young person who once had dreams, the person who loved a song that no one else in the community liked, the person who wanted to read a certain book, the person who once had a dream that belonged entirely to them. Those parts may not have disappeared. They may simply be waiting to be named. And perhaps tonight, as you listen to this story in the quiet of your room, remember that freedom does not necessarily have to feel like something enormous. Sometimes, freedom is simply the ability to say, "I am allowed not to know." You do not need to immediately discover who you are. You do not need to immediately adopt a new belief system. You do not need to replace one world with another. You are allowed to remain in the empty space for a while. Because emptiness is not always loss. Sometimes, it is where a person begins to choose. And as those choices gradually grow, something important begins to appear. Trust in yourself. Not the belief that you will always be right, but the belief that you are capable of thinking, making mistakes, correcting yourself, learning, setting boundaries, and moving forward. That is a deeper form of freedom. But the journey does not end when someone walks through the old door. After escaping a system that once told them how to live, they must learn something even more difficult. How do I rebuild my life without needing someone else to decide it for me? And that is where we will enter the next chapter, healing. Learning to trust yourself again. Healing. Learning to trust yourself again. After stepping out of a world that once defined who you were. The road ahead is not always as open as people imagine. Some doors may have closed, but inside the mind, the old rooms can still remain. A person may have physically left, yet the rules, fears, and voices repeated thousands of times can still quietly live within them. That is why healing is not simply about forgetting the past. It is a slower journey. Learning to trust yourself again. Perhaps the first thing a person must relearn is the right to question. When someone has lived for too long in an environment where every answer was provided for them, they may become afraid of their own thoughts. Every decision can feel as though it requires permission. Every emotion may seem to need an explanation. Every time they say no can come with a sense of guilt. And then, one day, they face a very small choice. Do I want to go this weekend? No one else answers. There is no rule. There is no leader. There is only them. On the surface, it is an ordinary question. But for someone who is healing, it can be a very significant step, because autonomy does not always begin with great decisions. It often begins with choices so small that other people might not even notice them. What do I want to eat? What do I want to read? Who do I want to see? Do I want to answer this message? Do I need to say no? These choices are like small stones placed along a path that never existed before. With every choice, a person learns a little more. I can decide. And from there, trust in oneself begins to return. One simple but powerful tool that can support this process is journaling. Not to create a perfect version of yourself. You do not need to write beautiful sentences. You only need to be honest. Today, I felt afraid. Today, I said no. Today, I missed the people from my past. Today, I questioned my decision. Today, I felt happy because I chose something small for myself. When emotions are written down, they are no longer just vague clouds inside the mind. They become things that can be seen. And when we can see them, we begin to recognize something important. Emotions are real, but emotions do not necessarily have to become commands. I can be afraid and still move forward. I can miss someone and still know that I need to keep my distance. I can feel guilty and still stand by my decision. I can be uncertain and still continue living. This is a profound form of maturity, because many highly controlling systems depend upon the illusion that people must always be certain. But life outside those systems does not work that way. No one can know everything with certainty. No one can guarantee that a choice will always be right. No one can give us a perfect map. And so, healing also means learning to live with uncertainty. This can be difficult. If someone was taught that there is only one correct answer, they may feel terrified when they discover that life contains hundreds of possible answers. But uncertainty is not necessarily an abyss. It can also be the space where freedom lives. When no one is telling you who you must become, you have the opportunity to explore. You can try. You can make mistakes. You can change. You can say, "Today, I think this way. But tomorrow, I may think differently." That is not weakness. That is the capacity to grow. Carl Gustav Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This quote is often mentioned when discussing the journey of becoming oneself. But for someone who is healing, it can carry a particularly profound meaning, because after years of being defined by others, becoming yourself is not an act of selfishness. It is a journey home. Not a return to the person others wanted you to become, but a return to the deeper part of yourself that once knew how to be curious, choose, love, and ask questions. And to do that, people need safe relationships. Not relationships where everyone always agrees with them, but relationships that allow them to disagree. A good friend does not need to say, "You have to listen to me." They can say, "I see things differently, but I still respect you." A healthy relationship does not make you afraid of losing love every time you set a boundary. It allows you to say, "No," and the love is still there. This can be an especially important experience for someone who once lived in an environment where love was tied to obedience, because they need to experience a simple truth again. Love does not have to be purchased with obedience. You do not have to agree with someone to deserve their respect. You do not have to sacrifice every boundary to prove your loyalty. You do not have to become the person someone else wants you to be in order to be loved. And every time a person says no, without losing a healthy relationship, another piece of trust in themselves is rebuilt. At first, that no may be very quiet. It may tremble. It may feel incredibly difficult, but it is still a no. And sometimes, one small no becomes the foundation of an entire self-directed life. Along this journey, the past also needs to be viewed with compassion. A person may blame themselves. Why didn't I realize it sooner? Why did I believe it? Why didn't I leave? But these questions often do little to heal. Instead, try asking, what did I need at that time? What did I believe? Who was I trying to protect? What was I doing my best to handle within the circumstances I had? A person should not be judged by knowledge they only gained after everything had already happened. It is easy to look back at the past with the understanding we have today. But the person we were yesterday did not possess what the person we are today possesses. And so, healing also means learning to forgive the earlier version of yourself. Not forgiving in order to deny what happened, but so that you do not have to carry it as a life sentence. Perhaps one day, someone who once lived inside a controlling system will look at themselves and realize, "I lost so much time." But then they may also say, "And from today onward, the time I have left belongs to me." That is a beautiful moment, because healing does not mean becoming the person you once were. You may no longer be who you were back then, and that is okay. You may carry more wounds, but you also carry more understanding. You know what it feels like to lose your freedom. You know how an inner voice can be silenced, and because of that, you can learn how to protect that voice. One day, you may wake up and no longer need to ask, "Who am I supposed to be today?" Instead, you simply ask, "How do I want to live today?" Perhaps that is one of the deepest signs of healing. Not when every fear disappears, but when fear is still there, and yet it no longer holds the steering wheel. You do. And along that road, one final lesson awaits, a lesson that may encompass the entire journey we have taken together. Freedom is not having all the answers. Freedom is having the right to ask questions. Keep your identity. Love people who are different from you. Set boundaries. And walk away when a place no longer feels right for you. And that is where we will bring this journey to its conclusion. The final lesson. Freedom is the right to ask questions. The final lesson. Freedom is the right to ask questions. After all the stories we have explored, perhaps what remains is not a list of things we should fear. Not every unusual community, every deeply held belief, every distinctive ritual, or every charismatic leader is necessarily dangerous. For centuries, human beings have gathered together to build communities, share beliefs, search for meaning, and face the uncertainties of life together. These things are deeply human. The real question lies somewhere deeper. How does a community treat a person's inner freedom? Because the boundary between a healthy community and a controlling system does not necessarily lie in whether the community is unusual. It lies in a simple question. Are you allowed to say, "I disagree"? If the answer is yes, dialogue can still exist. If the answer is no, we need to start paying attention. A healthy community is not afraid of questions, because questions are not necessarily acts of betrayal. Sometimes, questions are signs of maturity. A person can say, "I believe this," and at the same time, "But I want to understand why." Those two things are not contradictory. In fact, a belief can truly become our own only when we have the freedom to examine it from different perspectives and still choose it for ourselves. If a person is allowed to believe only because they are afraid, then that belief is no longer entirely free. If a person stays only because they are afraid of being rejected, then that belonging is no longer entirely free. If a person must abandon their identity in order to be loved, then that is no longer freely given love. And if a person is not allowed to leave, then that loyalty needs to be understood through a very different question. Perhaps this is one of the most important things Carl Gustav Jung can help us reflect upon. A human being needs to become themselves. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." This is not a call for people to become selfish or isolate themselves from community. Instead, it reminds us that a person cannot fully mature if their entire identity is determined by others. We can belong to a family. We can belong to a religion. We can belong to a community. We can love another person. We can devote ourselves to an ideal and still preserve one small room inside the soul where we alone hold the key. Inside that room, we can think. We can doubt. We can change. We can say, "I don't know yet. I disagree. I need more time. This is not right for me. And even, I want to leave." A healthy community may feel hurt when someone leaves, but it does not need to destroy that person because of their decision. That is a deeply important boundary, because love does not mean ownership, belonging does not mean surrendering your autonomy, and loyalty does not mean giving up your ability to think. We also need to be careful of another mistake. We should never mistake difference for evidence of danger. A community that dresses differently from us is not necessarily dangerous. A person with different beliefs is not necessarily wrong. An unfamiliar ritual is not automatically manipulation. A charismatic leader is not necessarily a controlling one. What matters is not how different they are from us. What matters is, how do they treat a person's freedom? Are you allowed to disagree? Can you maintain relationships outside the group? Do you have the right to protect your privacy? Can you set boundaries? Can you keep control over your money, your time, and your body? Can you leave without being threatened, humiliated, or isolated? If the answer is yes, then being different is not necessarily a problem. But if the answer gradually becomes no, then we are seeing something far more significant than simply being unusual. We are seeing power. And perhaps, after everything we have explored, this is the simplest way to recognize a healthy relationship. Can you be yourself there? Can you say no? Can you change? Can you ask questions? Can you walk away and still be recognized as a person of value? If the answer is yes, you still have room to breathe. If not, perhaps it is time to listen to what you feel inside. You do not need to rush. You do not need to make a judgment immediately. Simply observe, because sometimes freedom begins with something very small, the ability to recognize that you have a choice. And that choice does not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it is closing a book and saying, "I do not agree with this." Sometimes it is staying in contact with a friend someone wants you to cut off. Sometimes it is saying, "This is my body." Sometimes it is admitting, "I have changed." And sometimes it is simply sitting alone in a quiet room and asking, "What do I truly want?" That question may seem small, but it can open an entire world. Because when a person is no longer allowed to ask questions, all they can do is repeat. But when a person can ask questions, they begin to have the ability to choose. And when choice becomes possible, identity begins to take shape. That is why we should not simply teach people what to believe. We need to teach them how to think. Not only how to find answers, but how to ask a good question. Not only how to find a community, but how to recognize whether that community respects them. Not only how to love, but also that love should never require them to lose themselves. Not only how to be loyal, but that loyalty should never erase their conscience. And perhaps this is the most beautiful message we can carry with us as we bring this journey to an end. You do not need to doubt everything. You do not need to believe everything either. You only need to preserve enough freedom within yourself to be able to say, "Let me think about this." Tomorrow, you may still hold the same beliefs you hold today, or you may change. Both can be part of growth, because maturity does not mean never changing. Maturity means knowing why you change. And if there is one thing worth carrying with you after these 20 parts of our journey, perhaps it is something very simple. A psychologically healthy person is not someone who is unaffected by others. It is someone who can still return to themselves and make their own choices. Hold on to your right to ask questions. Hold on to your right to say no. Hold on to your right to love people who are different from you. Hold on to your right to change. Hold on to your right to walk away. And most importantly, hold on to your right to become who you truly are. Because in the end, freedom does not mean living a life untouched by the influence of others. Freedom means knowing that the final voice over your life still belongs to you. And perhaps now, as the night has grown quieter, you do not need to think about anything else. Let the stories you have heard tonight settle slowly. Let the questions remain. You do not need to answer them tonight. Tomorrow will still be there, and you will still have the right to choose. Take a gentle breath in, and slowly breathe out. Let your mind rest. You do not need to solve everything in a single night. Some questions take years to answer. Some parts of ourselves need time to be understood, and that is completely okay. Good night, and may you have a truly peaceful sleep. As you drift into sleep, I hope you can gently set aside the worries of today and allow your mind to return to the quietness that has always existed within you. If this journey into the human mind through the perspective of Carl Gustav Jung has given you a new thought to reflect on, consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for the stories to come, because sometimes a story we listen to before sleep does more than help us sleep more deeply. It can help us understand ourselves more deeply. Sleep well, and remember, you always have the right to ask questions.